Okay.
Don't go to work. They don't go to work. They don't go to work. They don't get food. They don't go to work. They don't get food. They don't go to work. They don't go to work. They don't go to work. They don't go to work.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. Welcome to Organizing in the Time of COVID-19. This is Rcmp from Daraja Press. My guest today is the amazing Desmond Cole, a Canadian journalist, activist, author, and broadcaster who lives in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. He's the author of an extraordinary book, The Skin We're In, and essential, what I believe is essential reading for understanding the depth of racism and of silences in Canada. We will be discussing what COVID has revealed about the nature of racism here. Welcome to the show, Desmond. Really nice to have you on the show. I gather you've been really busy this morning at a demonstration. Can you say something about it?
Yeah, first of all, Feroz, thank you very much for having me. It's an honor to speak with you and with your audience. I was at a demonstration. I just came from it this morning. It was a demonstration in front of a building downtown, which acts as a referral center for folks who are seeking emergency shelter. So our emergency shelter system here in Toronto is completely overwhelmed. It has been overwhelmed for literally decades. It's an ongoing crisis that never gets the attention that it deserves from our city officials and from the public at large. And so today, this referral center was the site of a demonstration where members of Ontario Coalition Against Poverty, the Toronto Overdose Prevention Service, and others gathered to say once again that homelessness continues to be a crisis, and that more specifically what we're seeing right now, Feroz, is as the government feels safer to reopen businesses and workplaces in the wake of COVID and in the midst still of COVID, there's a greater desire to push homeless people who are sleeping in parks, who are sleeping in alleyways, who are sleeping under bridges. There's a greater urgency by the city now, not to help and support those people, but to actually force them out of sight so that they don't have to be seen as people try to enjoy fine dining. You know, all of our patios have been kind of just moved outdoors now. And what I mean by that is that spaces that were not patios in front of restaurants before have become makeshift patios, and the city has all kinds of time and resources to help expand the space for restaurants, expand their property, as it were, into the public space so that they can have people dining outside and enjoying themselves, while they say a homeless person using a park and using that space is trespassing and will be approached by city workers and police to try and evict them from those spaces. So the demonstration today was to try and fight back against that, and I was honored to speak at it amongst many others.
So I mean, under conditions of the pandemic, COVID, what additional stress has that added to people who are homeless?
It's hard to quantify, really, because as I've mentioned, you know, we've had such an emergency for so long when it comes to housing in the city of Toronto. But some examples include the emergency shelter system in Toronto, which is supposed to be just that. It is literally supposed to be an emergency last resort system, has just become warehousing for the homeless, as my friend John Clark of Ontario Coalition Against Poverty has said many times. It's a warehousing system. And it is not a system where people are then being referred to permanent housing. It is simply a place to keep them out of sight until such time that they are kicked out, until such time that the conditions in there are no longer safe for them and they choose to leave. But right now, during COVID, the city failed to provide adequate shelter sites in terms of creating physical distancing for people so that all of the legislated requirements that you have to keep a certain distance from people, that you have to cover your face, that you have to be trying to wash your hands and things. In a shelter situation, the facilities simply are not set up for things like physical distancing, regular hand washing. They're not set up for this kind of purpose. So they're by definition unsafe. Rather than make those things safe, the city just tried to skate by. And then several organizations sued the city of Toronto to say, if you're not providing physical distancing in your shelters, you're breaking your own laws. That lawsuit has prompted the city to now change some of its standards, but you can imagine the incredible stress that that put on people who had to stay in these cramped, unsafe spaces nevertheless. We have had COVID outbreaks in some of our shelters and respite centers. We have situations where people are living outside in places like parks, and there is no clean water for them to even use. And the city intentionally turns off water sources in these public areas to discourage people from staying there. So it is a very defensive and punitive kind of approach to an already dire situation. And then, of course, we have these evictions. So people in places like Moss Park, Alexandra Park, Lampard Stadium, in places in the city of Toronto, Trinity Bellwoods Park, they are being approached by city workers, and the city workers make them offers for what they call hotels. These are not hotels. They are hotel spaces or empty spaces that are being run as if they are shelters. People are being kicked out of these so-called hotels for smelling of marijuana. People are being kicked out of these spaces for inviting a friend to come and visit them because the city says they are not allowed to do that. And then people are ending up back on the street. And if you don't accept these orders or these offers from the city for temporary inadequate housing that doesn't allow you to use drugs, that doesn't allow you to bring visitors, if you just don't accept these meager and temporary offers, then the city comes behind with the police to physically evict people from camps, destroy their property, throw their property in the garbage, and sometimes even arrest people for simply existing in those spaces. So it's quite dire. And what we're seeing, as we're seeing all over the world, I think right now, is that the pandemic isn't prompting new kinds of responses from government. Their instinct is to double down on the kinds of punitive policies and actions that they've been engaging in to hide the devastation that COVID is now combining into things like homelessness.
One of the things I was really impressed with in reading your book was the way in which you covered so many different aspects. And just recently, a couple of days ago, there was an article in the Guardian, UK Guardian, about the conditions of migrant workers in Canada. These are poorly paid workers who are brought over here so that they can produce at a cheap rate the food that Canadians depend on. Can you say a little bit more about the conditions that migrant labor face?
Yes, this is such a big topic right now because in Canada, our food supply is dependent on cheap labor by people mainly from the global south and from developing countries who are a lot poorer off than Canada is. We do not allow these temporary workers to attain status while they're working in Canada in most cases. We do not give them the same access to our universal healthcare system that we as Canadians have. So it is not a universal system because people who live here cannot access it. These workers who come primarily from Mexico and the Caribbean do not get access to employment insurance and other benefits if they are to fall ill. And this is a tactic by the Canadian government to essentially create a revolving door of underpaid labor from Mexico and the Caribbean so that if a person does get sick, so that if a person complains about their working conditions, they can be sent home in favor of a new worker who hopefully won't raise as much trouble. Now, that was the condition before COVID-19. Now, what we're seeing during COVID-19 is that the Canadian border is actually closed to almost all travel, but these underpaid and abused immigrant workers are deemed to be essential in this crisis. So they are deemed to be essential, but they are not paid anymore. They are forced to live in disgusting and cramped quarters as they have always been, but which are now much more dangerous because of the pandemic, and people are dying. There have been at least 3 workers in Southern Ontario who farm things like tomatoes, workers from Mexico who have died of COVID-19 as a result of these unsanitary conditions. We also have situations like what we're seeing in Quebec, where I write about in my book the thousands of Haitian asylum seekers who had protections under the Obama administration to be allowed to stay in the United States, because, you know, I'm sure many of us know about, you know, all of the turmoil in Haiti, whether that be the political instability created by Canada, the United States, France, and many other countries, going back to 2004 with the removal of Jean-Bertrand Aristide. And since that time, Haiti has suffered a massive earthquake that killed hundreds of thousands of people, a cholera outbreak, which was brought in by United Nations peacekeepers. And so it's been a terribly unsafe place in Haiti for many years. And some Haitians were able to secure temporary stay in America. When Trump came into office, he ended that temporary stay, or has started moving anyway to end it. And there are legal battles around it. But in the meantime, Haitians didn't feel safe in America. What did they do? They followed the instructions of the Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, who said, if you are fearing persecution, if you are fleeing violence, come to Canada and you will be safe. Well, those thousands of Haitians did cross the border, often near L'École Québec, to come into Canada to find safety and to find a better life. They were all arrested en masse and put into the immigration process to attempt to remove them. Haitian asylum seekers have one of the lowest rates of acceptance into the system seeking asylum in Canada. And now, during COVID-19, even though they do not have status, even though they face potential removal, hundreds of Haitians without status are working in Quebec's long-term care facilities, taking care of people who are ill, taking care of people who are at great risk of COVID-19, and putting themselves and their own families at tremendous risk to contracting this illness and dying as well. And one of the biggest outbreaks outside of Montreal's nursing home system has actually been in a place in Montreal North, where a concentration of Haitian migrants are living at this time.
Yeah. And I think that raises the other thing about what I was impressed about your book was lifting the veil from the silences, if I can mix those metaphors. That I find in Canada, the presence of African people in Canada. Can you say something about why you think there has been such silence about that, and what the present situation is in terms of the struggle of Black people, especially in cities like Toronto, but not exclusively, in terms of facing both the violence of the state and the crushing of the COVID pandemic?
Well, one of the reasons, Feroz, that I chose to write this book in the first place is that the struggle for Black life in Canada is very cleverly and dangerously obscured by our government and by our culture. Canada's culture and identity is one of negation. So how do you identify yourself as a Canadian first and foremost? Well, you say, I'm not an American, right? It's identity through being not something, negation, right? But what that does is it suggests to people outside of Canada and to ourselves as Canadians that anything that is happening in the United States could not possibly be happening here. And even if it is, it doesn't matter to document or talk about it or fight back against it, because it must be worse in America than it is here. And so when it comes to Blackness, Canada has managed to do things like contrast itself to America and say they had slavery, we had the Underground Railroad that helped enslaved Black people escape from the United States into Canada. Now, that's a part of history, but another bigger part of Canadian history is the hundreds of years where the British Crown enslaved African people here on this territory that's now called Canada, where the French did the same thing in what is now Quebec, enslaving African people hundreds and hundreds of years, even before Canada was called that territory. We have to talk about the enslavement, of course, alongside of that, and the theft of land, of culture, the genocide against indigenous peoples of this country, just as in the United States of America. So colonialism didn't try to stop itself at what is now the 49th parallel. We were doing the exact same things here for hundreds of years. And of course, that has led to a country in Canada where, in my city in Toronto, Black people are 20 times more likely to be murdered by the police today than white people are, a city where we have 30% child poverty, and in that, a tremendous population of Black people are poor. This is a city with tremendous wealth and resources to support people, but what we see that just as the residential school system and the 60s scoop were created to separate Indigenous families, to take their culture away, to take their religious practices and spiritual practices away. The government said that residential schools were to kill the Indian in the child. So that was an intentional policy that's been going on for hundreds of years in this country. But today in Toronto, 40% of the new child welfare cases are of Black children and their families. So colonial systems have always acted violently, not just against Indigenous peoples in Canada, but also against Black peoples. And because we're so obsessed with saying it's worse in the United States, that is our tactic for saying, who cares about Black people in Canada? Let's not even talk about it, because of course we know that anti-Blackness is all about bargaining things down to the lowest common denominator. So a Black person in Canada, no matter how bad we are suffering, is supposed to feel fortunate that we are not being oppressed by Trump and the Americans. That is anti-Blackness personified. It is the passive-aggressive and polite anti-Blackness that Canada is so good at.
Yeah, I mean, the other silences, although I do think it has changed. I mean, certainly in the last 10, 15 years, when I visited Canada before, the presence or even the existence of Indigenous people and their lives was almost unacknowledged. Where I think probably since the Idle No More organizing, that has become much more apparent, and we are seeing people at least acknowledging the stolen land. There's no debate yet about giving it back, but there is this acknowledgement. You talk about the role of the Rcmp in crushing the rebellions, and that's not just distant history, it's something apparently recurring. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Well, all of these systems, of course, are working in tandem with one another to uphold white supremacy, right? To further entrench the theft of traditional Indigenous territory and put it in the hands of white settlers, and to say that that's the way that things have always been. What we call the Royal Canadian Mounted Police Force today used to be called the Northwestern Mounted Police. And the creation of the Northwestern Mounted Police by the British was to push Indigenous peoples off of their lands and to kill them if they were not compliant with that order, and to police them in the new places that the British were forcing them onto. So that's a tradition many generations old in Canada, which has now morphed itself into the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. What does the RCMP do? Well, we've just seen earlier this year the incredible resistance of people on Wet'suwet'en territory in Western Canada who are saying that we don't want the government to put pipelines through our traditional territories and we do not consent to that. It was actually The Guardian that broke a story saying that the RCMP had orders to shoot to kill peaceful Indigenous people who were demonstrating against the government on their land. I say peaceful to point out that that is the case, but I am not actually interested in narratives around peaceful or unpeaceful protest. When the government can shoot to kill you, it's not the time to talk about peaceful resistance anymore, because that is not a peaceful government, and those are not actors in good faith trying to negotiate with the Wet'suwet'en. What is the RCMP doing? It is responding to Indigenous women like Chantel Moore, who in New Brunswick, somebody had a wellness check put out to her to make sure in her apartment that she was all right. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police showed up to her apartment and murdered her. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police assaulted an Indigenous chief recently by the name of Alan Adam, thinking that the video of this horrible assault against him would not be made public. It was. And all of the charges that the police, the RCMP, laid against this Indigenous man after assaulting him were magically dropped as soon as the video of their assault on him came out. It is not a coincidence that the Royal Canadian Mounted Police continue the traditional role that they have played on these territories of pushing Indigenous people off territory, of policing them in the territories that the government says that they are allowed to be in, and of even taking their lives for the simple act of resistance, non-compliance, confusion, fear. So when we talk about abolishing police today in Canada, we are also talking about the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. We're talking about provincial police forces. We're talking about police officers who are stationed in our schools, who are stationed on public transit in Toronto and Vancouver and other places. We're not trying to limit this to local police. We're talking about a scope of behavior, which also, I must add, has to include the mandate that these police get from the white public. On my way here on the subway, I saw a person go up to the booth and report a man who had apparently walked into the bus bay area without paying for a ticket and saying that man hasn't paid. This is why policing exists. This is not to attack somebody who's committing a crime. It is not to protect people who are poor or struggling. It's not to protect women who are the victims of domestic abuse. The reason the police exist is so that a white person who feels uncomfortable with somebody in their community can have a violent and authorized violent response to their discomfort. And so I was watching while I was waiting for my bus to see if a transit police or other officials would be called to deal with somebody who probably just doesn't have enough money to ride public transit. Poverty is the criminalization, race is the criminalized thing. And that's what our billions of dollars is being deployed on for policing. White people can never feel safe, so it doesn't matter how many police they have, they always want more. But it is not to actually prevent violence. It's often to engage in forms of violence, mainly against the poor, the homeless, Black, Indigenous people, other people of color, people who use drugs, sex workers, those who have traditionally faced oppression in our society, queer and trans people. So it's really this push about defunding and abolishing the police. It's really about being honest about what the police do versus the white supremacist fantasy of what they're said to do and whom they're said to protect.
So the uprisings that occurred as a result of the torture and killing of George Floyd in public has led to massive uprisings across the USA, and indeed reflected in solidarity actions in other countries, including here in Canada. But to what extent has that movement helped change the discourse here in Canada in relation to what needs to be done about racism?
That's a great question. We are definitely in solidarity with Americans who have risked everything during this pandemic to say I will not remain inside and in fear while the police outside are murdering George Floyd for the crime of, in their words, trying to pay with a fake $20 bill. That alleged crime cost a man his life, and people had to watch him on camera being murdered. I didn't watch that video, and I cannot and will not watch that video, because the idea that Black people being murdered is an empirical problem, that we do not have the evidence to prosecute, to hold accountable police, that hurts my heart. The idea that white people who don't believe us want to watch 9 minutes of a person being murdered on camera and then want to tell us that from watching someone be murdered, they have learned things, they have reflected in a new way on things, because they could not simply take our word for it as Black people. That is devastating to me. But we are not only in solidarity with the incredible resistance work of people in Minneapolis and across America who are still in the streets to this day, marching in cities across America, fighting against policing. We're talking about Chantal Moore, who I mentioned. We're talking about Regis Korchinski-Paquette, a 29-year-old woman who last month fell to her death after being accosted by several Toronto police officers in a non-violent situation. We're talking about DeAndre Campbell, a 26-year-old man in Brampton, a suburb of Toronto, who called the police himself for help, who lived with schizophrenia, and had the police come into his home and murder him in the presence of his family members when he called 911 for help. So it is not merely a solidarity movement with George Floyd. It is us bringing attention in this country to the ways in which Black and Indigenous and other people of color are murdered. A man with schizophrenia named Ijaz Chowdhury, a 62-year-old man living on his own with schizophrenia, was accosted by what amounts to a SWAT team. They brought a K9 unit. They burst into this man's apartment one evening a couple of weeks ago and murdered him. 62 years old with schizophrenia, and these cowards deployed dogs and a SWAT team to come get this man. These are the realities in Canada every day, whether the media chooses to report them or not, or I think moreover, it's not even just about mere reporting. It's about making the connection between what do these incidents of police violence actually mean and where are they coming from. That is the thing that our media refuses to do. And that's really the reason why I wrote that book, is to say that we do not mimic what we see in the United States. We feed off of the incredible energy and organizing that they create to help shine light on our own issues here. And we are very much indebted to Black Americans for their ongoing struggle.
But has it changed the confidence that people have to organize? Has it changed the way people are talking about the situation of racism?
In the short term, absolutely it has. I have never seen the amount of organizing that I am witnessing right now, nor have I ever seen the ability of people who are doing that organizing to connect what might seem to some like disparate issues of food security, housing, the need for supports for people who use drugs, anti-policing, really connecting this struggle against capitalism, right? Global capitalism against a system that says that the rich can actually make money during the global pandemic, but that the rest of us need austerity measures, right? I think one of the great distillations of this that just happened last week is that, so our city council has responded to the calls here to defund the police by actually increasing the police's budget. They just voted to increase the police's budget to purchase body cameras. Again, this empirical fallacy that the reason that the police aren't held to accountable is that we can't catch them doing what they're doing. That is a lie, of course. It is that this is a distraction so that we don't have to believe the experiences and testimony of Black, Indigenous, people of color, and others. But just after increasing the police budget, the mayor came out, John Tory of this city, with a press conference saying he needs $1.3 billion now for next year's budget in Toronto. And if he doesn't receive that $1.3 billion from the province of Ontario and the government of Canada, he is going to have to cut homelessness services. He is going to have to cut childcare and transit services. Interestingly enough, Firuz, the budget of the Toronto Police $1.22 billion. So almost the exact amount of money that John Tory is saying that he doesn't have for life-saving, everyday basic services is what is being invested in our police. And while he can find extra millions to boost their budget for body cameras, he says he cannot find any money for housing, childcare, and the like. This is the anti-capitalist, anti-imperial struggle that all of us are going through right now. And I have never seen the fearless organizing that I am witnessing right now, and the ability, as I said, of folks to kind of connect these issues and to be in solidarity with one another. So we have a lot of work to do to sustain the energy that we're seeing right now, but there's no doubt in my mind that something has very much changed, at least in the short term.
I mean, it's nice to hear at last the big C word, capitalism, and I also jokingly, in reality, if one looks at what is happening, well, we talked about migrant workers, but who are they working for? It's big agriculture. It's also the experience of the indigenous people is not so much that they're being chucked out of their places. Their lands are being turned into form places of extraction of massive wealth by the transnationals. To what extent do you think that consciousness about that this is linked to the nature of capital, to what extent is that being understood or is emerging in the discourse amongst these people who are organizing?
Well, this is part of the everyday education work that I think Black and Indigenous peoples especially are always engaging in. When we talk about the pipelines that the government is determined to build in Western Canada, the actual purchase of what used to be the Trans Mountain Pipeline by the federal government to secure that project and to make sure that somehow it goes through. The oil sands in Western Canada are suffering tremendously right now as a result of COVID. Investment has dropped, the price of oil has plummeted. And so there's great doubt, as there always has been, about whether projects like that can even be finished. But the governments of certain parts of Western Canada, particularly the provincial governments of Saskatchewan and Alberta, have been very activist in saying, we can't have jobs and you Canadian folks can't have a good life unless you support oil and gas. The only way for your children to eat, the only way for your families to have food, and particularly Indigenous peoples, the only way for you to have a future is for you to support oil and gas development. And I think that as time goes on, more and more people are seeing that, the instability of those kinds of projects, the temporariness of those kinds of projects that can, for example, provide jobs to some people for 2 or 3 years while setting up these projects, and then those jobs just disappear. People are starting to recognize that. And I think that the work that we're always trying to do is to help people understand. So for example, we were talking before about the food supply in Canada. Why can you afford the food that you eat? Because somebody is being paid less than minimum wage and being provided no benefits and no resources so that your food can remain cheap. And it is your demand for cheap food that actually puts people from the Caribbean and Mexico in the living conditions that they do. So we cannot have both of these things. Our Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, is very fond of saying that there is no conflict between the environment and the economy. Nothing could be further from the truth, of course, but I believe that that rhetoric is being very severely pushed back against in this time of economic austerity that continues. And now, I mean, what's going to happen? I'm not actually a big proponent of saying that COVID is over ever, or that it's that we're in reopening phase now, all these terminologies that people like to use. COVID has changed our lives forever. Thousands of Canadians have already died because of COVID. Thousands more who have become ill have had their health compromised for the rest of their lives. Even if they do survive, they will need ongoing treatment and care, which will be expensive. So there is no reopening after such a crisis. There is no back to so-called normal. Dion Brand, one of our most cherished writers and Black thinkers in this country, wrote recently in the Toronto Star about how many of us do not want the normal that was being offered to us before. And so I do think that awareness about the everyday hell that capitalism produces is increasing. And it's even seen in things like the employment benefit program that the government rolled out at the beginning of COVID. This program is not available to many non-citizens, first of all. So it suggests that some of you in a pandemic do not deserve or need government support as every other Canadian does, but also that that support is temporary and that the government cannot afford to take care of its own citizens during a global crisis, that its support for us by its nature is temporary. I think that that has been really destabilizing for a lot of people who never thought in a country like Canada that so many limitations would be put on our ability to survive, and that our government in such a crisis would essentially say that it is helpless to provide ongoing support. It's really eye-opening.
So where do you see the opening up of hope? Where do you see the cracks which let the light in?
Well, I mean, I'll say this, right? There is a move right now amongst our political and elite class to try and absorb all of the work that's being done by Black and Indigenous people, by other radical activists, by queer and trans people, by anti-poverty groups, by food justice groups, but particularly around this issue of the police. What we're seeing is an attempt to co-opt all of the energy that has been created. What do I mean by that? Our police chief, Mark Saunders, is retiring early. He has announced that he is stepping back from his position. But before he announced that, in the couple of days before he did that, he went into the street in this very, very ridiculous public demonstration of his own, and he took a knee. He knelt down on the ground. Now, what the police chief, who is responsible for so much murder and suffering in Toronto, what him kneeling is going to do to heal anything, I don't know. Justin Trudeau, our prime minister, did the same thing in the same time frame, where he went to a demonstration and he knelt down on the ground for a moment or two. What this is, like every corporate, attempt, we're going to take Aunt Jemima off of the syrup. We're going to issue a corporate statement saying that we're in solidarity with Black people in this moment. That is all in an attempt to say, don't panic, don't get angry, don't organize, especially don't organize. There's nothing to organize about. We've heard you, and we're going to take some nondescript action that we will inform you about at some time in the future. So that's what we're facing. Where do I see hope, though? I see hope when I go to an event like I did today, and I'm seeing that people are starting in their own neighborhoods encampment support networks, they're being called. So people are seeing that in the local park where they live, people have set up encampments, and they're going down with food. They're going down with water. They're creating little committees to start talking about how better can we organize the support for people who are living in our neighborhoods and who are having a tough time. We're seeing people organizing en masse against evictions. Evictions were not supposed to be happening during this pandemic in Ontario, but they persist in many cases anyway. But you have a bigger problem, which is that if your landlord cannot evict you, they nevertheless can accrue debt against you for not paying your rent. And what we're very fearful of now in Ontario is that in the coming days, the tribunals for court for evictions are going to be open again. And at that time, landlords can say, well, you haven't paid your rent in 5 months, I'm evicting you. And this is going to be a huge, huge problem for those who were spared by a very short-sighted eviction moratorium in Ontario. But I have not seen this kind of organizing against evictions and for tenants' rights in my many years, 15 plus years in this city. I have never seen white people coming out into the street en masse to talk about police brutality, to be educated, to sit in teach-ins, to hear the words and the lessons from people who have been doing this work for years. This is new. Black Lives Matter Toronto have been a force in this city since 2014, but I think that they are experiencing, and Black organizing in general is experiencing, a kind of renaissance that I wouldn't have anticipated at the beginning of this year. Hope is in the people. Hope is not in government officials or the white public changing their minds. Hope is not in the assumption or the hope that a white majority will finally see the humanity of people whose inhumanity, notions of inhumanity, they have thrived on all this time. So we're not waiting to convert people. We're not waiting for a 51% majority. We're waiting, or we're not waiting, we're organizing and we're moving and working to build power in our own communities in order to push back against the power that's at City Hall, at the province, and in Canada. I don't believe in taking power anymore. I don't believe that we should all run for office and try to engage that way to solve our problems. I think we have to make power in our communities, and that activity is really, really on an upswing right now. And that does give me a lot of hope.
I mean, when you mention Trudeau and police kneeling, I can't help in my mind think of the kneeling on George Floyd's neck. And I just wonder what's going through their minds when they do kneel.
Can I address that very briefly, because I'm grateful that you've brought that up, and it's a very painful thing to have to talk about, but we need to talk about it. There are so many Black people who are victimized by police brutality who survive. We say Black Lives Matter, and we insist on that rallying cry, that Black Lives Matter, to demonstrate that only when we are murdered can we even begin to get attention for police brutality. You know, George Floyd had somebody kneel on his neck until he suffocated. It is so callous and insensitive and thoughtless of people that they would use a symbol involving kneeling as a presumed honor to George Floyd, who is not coming back to his family and his community. It hurts me very much to see that happening, the thoughtlessness around it. But you know, I get a lot of calls from people who say that they're experiencing re-traumatization because they have had police use these kinds of physical tactics against them also. And so not only to have to see these videos being put out, but to see people in a so-called act of solidarity to putting their knee down on the ground, this is a very painful and thoughtless recreation of the violence that we're experiencing. And I wish that instead of just doing what people saw Colin Kaepernick do 3 years ago and thinking, okay, this is a legible social symbol of we're with you, Black people, that maybe take a little bit of thought to do something else that is more appropriate to the situation.
Well, Desmond, what's your next book?
Oh, my brother. So we're coming to the end of July. It has almost been 6 months since I released The Skin We're In, A Year of Black Resistance and Power. The events in the world recently have meant that a lot more people are taking interest in this book. It is now the #1 best-selling book in Canada, and I am so honored and proud to be able to say that. I'm so grateful for my editor, Martha Kanya-Forstner, my publicist, Scott Sellers, and the entire team of people at Penguin Random House and Doubleday Books who have supported me in this work. 6 months is not a long time, and I am just enjoying, like every day when I wake up, I'm enjoying the messages that I receive from people telling me that they are reading or have read the book, that it is making them think, that it is making them reflect, that they're learning. And I want to bask in that a little while longer, at least, before I start thinking about book #2.
But it is a really extraordinary book, Desmond, and I learned so much, and I've had to reflect on so many things. Being new to Canada, it was a real education. So I want to thank you for what you've done. I'm so glad that it is on the bestseller list, and it deserves that. But there is more to be done, and so we look forward to volume 2, Desmond.
In good time, I promise.
I just want to thank you so much for sparing time. I know you've been really busy, and I appreciate you taking the time to join us on this show. I know there'll be lots of people interested in the comments that you've made. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Feroz. It's a really great honor and pleasure to speak with you today.
Great. So I look forward to interviewing you in the next 6 months when we talk about your next book.
Most definitely.
Okay. Take care and keep well.
And you too.
Okay. Bye then.
Bye-bye.
That was the great, amazing Desmond Cole, author of The Skin We're In, essential reading, as I mentioned earlier on. Thank you for joining us on this show. This is Feroz Manji from Daraja Press. Thank you for joining us on Organizing in the Time of Chaos. Now, if I can manage to get our theme tune working again, I'll say goodbye to you by putting this on the screen. So go well, and look forward to you joining us on future shows.
They don't get food, they don't go to work. They don't go to work. They don't go to work. They don't get food. They don't go to work. They don't get food. They don't go to work. They don't go to work.